I hadn't been back in 12 years, and even now it wasn't by choice. The train slowed near the station, rusted signs, a coffee shack, still pretending it was new, and the same crooked mailbox at the Morgan farm. Magnolia Pines hadn't changed, but I had. As I stepped onto the platform, no one was waiting. Just a whisper of diesel and the weight of the past pressing on my shoulders. I adjusted my coat. Not because of the cold, but because people had already begun to stare. The woman at the ticket booth did a double-take. She recognized the shape of my face, but couldn't quite place it. Good. The invitation had come unsigned. A thick white envelope tucked inside a smaller one, like it hoped to go unnoticed. You are cordially invited to the wedding of Grace Ann Morgan and Ethan Cross. The name chilled me, but I didn't come to stop the wedding, not yet. I came to see who remembered the truth. The church was a spectacle of hydrangeas and curated joy. I slipped inside through a side entrance. Everyone else seemed dipped in sunlight and laughter. Me, I was the rain cloud they didn't expect or want. I caught my aunt's eye across the pews. She froze mid-smile, turned back around. My cousin Todd whispered something to his wife, and she whispered back, "That's her." The music hadn't started, but the judgment had. A teenage usher finally shuffled over with a paper-thin smile. Bride's family is toward the front, but maybe you'll be more comfortable in the back. He didn't wait for a response. Just handed me a program and walked away like I might explode. I took a seat by the aisle. 2 rows behind my parents who hadn't even turned around. My mother's hair was still dyed the same blonde it had been in 2003, still perfect, still hard. My father shifted slightly enough to glance back, but not enough to acknowledge me. I didn't expect balloons. I didn't even expect forgiveness. But silence cuts deeper when it's deliberate. From a few rows up, someone whispered, "Isn't she the one from that story? The whistleblower?" No, the hacker thing. The scandal. Didn't she vanish after DC? I heard she changed her name. I heard she got someone killed. No one asked me. They just whispered like I wasn't there. Like I was folklore come to life, too dangerous to acknowledge and too inconvenient to confront. Then I saw her Grace. The bride. My little cousin, now all grown up, beaming as she adjusted her veil. She hadn't seen me yet. I hoped she wouldn't. Beside her stood Ethan Cross, tall, slick. The kind of man whose smile arrived before he did. The kind who made backroom deals look like charity. I'd seen him before years ago in classified files and back-channel intel. A name that never quite got prosecuted but always stayed on the watch lists. Ethan Cross had vanished right when I did. And now here he was, marrying into my family. The choir began its first note. Guests stood. I didn't, because that was the moment I knew this wedding wasn't just a coincidence. It was a cover. A play staged for appearances. And like all good theater, it required the audience to believe the lie. I sat there in the shadows watching them walk the aisle like it meant something. Watching my family pretend history hadn't happened, that I hadn't existed. 12 years ago I disappeared to protect something bigger than myself. Now I was back, and someone was still lying. It wasn't until he stepped up to the altar that my pulse finally caught up with my instincts. Ethan Cross. I hadn't seen his face in 5 years. Not since the day his file disappeared from the shared directory at Interaxis, the day the entire subfolder marked level red, unresolved, was quietly purged from federal archives. The day I was told to shut up or disappear. And now here he was, wearing a tailored tux and a ring worth someone's mortgage. Smiling like a man who never buried a secret. Holding my cousin's hand like she was just another contract he'd negotiated into submission. He caught me looking. The eye contact was brief, half a second, maybe less, but it was enough. His smile didn't falter, but something behind his gaze flinched. Recognition, not fear, not surprise. Just recalibration? He turned back to Grace, placed a hand over hers, whispered something that made her laugh. The photographer snapped a picture. Everyone saw romance. I saw a man calculating optics in real time. I leaned back in the pew, fingers tightening around the wedding program like it might tell me how this script ends. 12 years ago, I was part of a task force investigating corporate breaches tied to biometric data trafficking. Ethan's name surfaced repeatedly tied to shell companies and data farms operating just outside jurisdiction. No convictions, no fingerprints, but too many coincidences to ignore. I flagged him for surveillance. Then I was told to let it go. I didn't, and the next week my clearance was pulled. My badge deactivated. 2 colleagues resigned. 1 disappeared. And I, Claire Morgan, lead analyst with the highest threat index profile in the unit, was erased like a typo. They called it a burnout, but now the burnout was sitting front row at a country club wedding in my hometown, marrying into my family. I scanned the crowd. No security, no publicists, no whisper of the controversy he used to carry like static. Instead, there were tech bros in pastel suits, city councilmen with drinks they hadn't paid for, and startup founders in rented shoes. One woman behind me whispered, "Can you believe he's from that AI firm? The one that rebuilt facial ID systems after the 2020 breach." Another replied, "Total redemption arc. Grace is so lucky." I closed my eyes. Redemption doesn't wear designer cufflinks. When the officiant began his speech, I pulled out my phone not to take photos but to check the wedding site. Grace and EthanForever.com. Cute, glossy, too polished. There was a link to RSVP, another to digitally check in. I tapped. It asked for biometric confirmation. Just for sentimental data tagging, it said. Bullshit. I pulled out a burner device from my coat, just in case. Logged into the mirror server. Within seconds, I was watching Code Pulse beneath the RSVP page. My name wasn't listed, but my device ID had pinged 2 geo-trackers the moment I stepped into the building. This wasn't a wedding guest list. It was a harvest. Facial scans, device fingerprints, even breath pattern sampling from the mic'd aisles. Every guest was being profiled in real time. I looked up, and there he was, Ethan, standing under the white arch, locking eyes with me again. This time he smiled wider, and I realized something that made my stomach hollow. He wasn't hiding. He was showing off. The reception was held in a glass-walled pavilion that overlooked the lake. Sunlight spilled in like it had been choreographed. Champagne towers shimmered, drone cameras floated above the tables, and guests uploaded selfies into a live memory wall that updated in real time on a massive screen near the dance floor. Every detail was designed to feel intimate, effortless, and expensive. But I couldn't stop seeing it like an operation. The man giving toasts at the center table had once been a private defense contractor. The DJ used to work in behavioral data modeling for social media influence campaigns. The drone crew rented from a company I'd flagged 3 years ago in a report that was buried before it ever saw daylight. And the check-in booths, they weren't check-in booths. I slipped away just after the first toast. The hallway behind the guest book station was barely lit and empty. I passed a coat closet, 2 shuttered kitchen service doors, and stopped in front of the memory capture hub, a sleek white structure covered in floral decals and QR codes. It looked like a photo booth, the kind people cram into after 1 too many drinks. But the inside was colder. Clinical. A built-in sensor panel ran along the left wall. Microphones embedded in the ceiling tiles, and a tiny printout on the mirror, "Smile for your future." The door closed behind me. I didn't smile. I opened my bag and pulled out the decoy phone. Jailbroken, modded, dead to the grid. I tethered it to the booth's backline and watched the terminal flicker to life. Access granted. Within 30 seconds, the truth began to bleed through the screen. The booth wasn't storing images. It was parsing them: bone structure, blink rate, thermal mapping, voice pitch, drift. There was a secondary layer scanning skin texture and vein pattern, which meant they were building biometric shadow profiles. the kind used in Level 3 surveillance nets or black market ID farms. This wasn't memories. It was data laundering. I checked the node pathway. The data wasn't just being collected. It was live-streamed to an offshore IP chain, bouncing across 3 countries, ending in a server host tagged to a consulting firm I recognized one of Ethan Cross's ghost entities. Of course it was. The booth pinged softly as it tried to reconnect to the main line. I severed the uplink, disabled the recovery failsafe, and pulled a mirrored copy of everything it had processed in the last 3 hours. Then I shut the door behind me and slipped out like a drunk bridesmaid looking for Advil. The hallway was still empty, but now my heart was racing. Back in the ballroom, Ethan was making the rounds, laughing, toasting, doing that thing sociopaths do where they mimic sincerity with Olympic-level precision. I stayed at the edge of the crowd, hands steady, breath slow. Every 20 minutes, a group of guests was invited to update their memories at the booth. They scanned their faces, left audio messages for the bride and groom, and walked away thinking they'd just left a time capsule. They didn't know they'd just been indexed. I noticed the servers wore wristbands, thin black bands that blinked red every time they passed the perimeter pillars. Geofencing tech. You don't use geofencing at a wedding. You use it when you're mapping a controlled zone, which meant the building was a live capture net. The guests were walking datasets. The event was the bait, and the mastermind was clinking glasses at the head table with my family. I moved to the coat room, found a narrow door marked staff only. It opened with a soft click and led to a control corridor lined with server racks. Each blinked in quiet rhythm. I slipped inside, locked the door behind me, and plugged into the main line. The logs confirmed it. The drones were scanning for facial patterns. The booths were scraping voice prints. Every phone that pinged the event Wi-Fi gave up at least partial geolocation access, even when the guests had said no. They'd overridden permission gates using an exploit I'd helped patch 5 years ago, back when I was still on the inside. The exploit was buried in an old firmware update one only a handful of people knew about. I recognized the signature and the code, fragmented but familiar. Mine. They'd repurposed my old code. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not rage, not pride, something colder violation. Ethan hadn't just escaped justice. He'd stolen the very tools we once used to stop people like him. My hands hovered over the keyboard. For a second, I thought about taking the whole system down. Then and there crashed the stream brick, the drones fry the memory booth. But no, I needed more than sabotage. I needed evidence, something public, undeniable. The door behind me creaked. I spun ready, but it was only a janitor. Teenager. Name tag said Miguel. His earbuds were in. He barely looked up, mumbled sorry, and wheeled his cart away, and wheeled his... I watched him go, then scanned the footage again, this time looking for the source of the facial data aggregator. And there it was, a private server node labeled Venus, short for Visual Extraction Network Unified Storage. Venus was siphoning the entire guest list, creating what looked like a deep clone reserve. If Ethan sold this, he could replicate identities, unlock banking access, breach private networks. The kind of breach that doesn't just destroy reputations, it erases people. You wouldn't even know you'd been stolen. I backed up the data, encrypted it, set a tracer, and then I walked out, back into the ballroom where people danced to a string quartet remix of Beyoncé, where Grace kissed Ethan's cheek and held up a glass for the cameras, where everything was perfect, and perfectly fake. I didn't smile. I just stood at the edge of it all, watching the room like it was a bomb counting down. Because now I didn't just suspect Ethan Cross was dangerous. Now I knew. The night had begun with champagne flutes and garden lanterns. Now it pulsed with something else. A quiet countdown. I left the ballroom just after the father-daughter dance. Grace was glowing. Ethan was playing the doting fiancé hand on her waist. Laughter too polished, too rehearsed. The guests had no idea that beneath the satin and roses they were data points being drained in real time. The whole thing had the rhythm of a heist, but I wasn't going to stop it alone. Not this time. Out by the catering trucks under a string of hanging lights, I pulled out a phone I hadn't touched in 6 years. No SIM, no signal. Only one function left alive, a clean line buried in a protocol I wrote in another life. I tapped the screen. It blinked twice, then again. A pattern only 3 people in the world would recognize. And I waited. 2 minutes later, the screen lit up. Access granted. Then you still breathing, Casey? I exhaled. Casey, you. Ex-NSA contractor turned whistleblower. She was the first to get blacklisted after she exposed the biometric mining in the federal border program. The Bureau labeled her a leak risk. She was forced into hiding with a fabricated diagnosis and a revoked passport. But I knew she never stopped watching. I typed fast. Cross is operational. Venus confirmed. Biometric harvest via civilian ceremony. Private node buried in reception core. Need eyes, she replied instantly. You finally calling in your ghosts? I'm not asking. I'm activating. Stand by. 15 seconds passed. Then the screen populated with 4 handles. Echo back, Nova Null, Scripture, Aurora Breach, all names I hadn't seen since the night we tore down the Sanborn Protocol, the black-budget surveillance op that never made the news because we buried it before it could reach the public. We weren't heroes. We weren't even friends. We were just the last ones left who refused to play nice. Now we were back online. Casey's voice came through first. Garbled through layers of encryption, but unmistakably hers. How poetic. A wedding full of strangers all giving away their faces in exchange for a glass of rosé. Venus is siphoning through a memory wall, I said. He's cloning ID shadows. He's not just cloning another voice cut in scripture. Real name unknown. Rumored to have built the original model for the data obfuscation layer that was hijacked by private defense. Venus is embedding behavioral prediction nodes. The guests aren't just being copied. They're being mapped. Long-term social targeting. So what's the plan? Morgan Casey asked. You want us to watch the circus or burn the tent? Both, I said. Silence. Then soft laughter. I hadn't realized how much I missed that sound, cynical, brilliant, defiant. The kind only people who had nothing left to lose allow themselves to make. We built a quick framework. I fed them my mirrored data. Casey launched a tracer bot to pin down the offshore storage. Scripture began tunneling a visual patch loop, one that would keep the security monitors showing looping footage of smiling guests while we cut into the actual data stream. Give me 15 minutes, said Nova Null. I'll ghost the primary node so you can hardjack the booth. I'll need to be on the floor, I said. Visible. He needs to think I'm watching, not working. You always did like multitasking, Casey said. Try not to get proposed to while we're bricking a billion-dollar system. The line clicked off. I looked up. Back in the ballroom, they were passing around sparklers for the couple's first dance under the stars. I watched Ethan through the glass wall, one hand on Grace, the other still controlling the entire operation from the smile on his face. I walked back in. Slower this time. Deliberate. Guests stepped aside without even realizing they were doing it. I made my way to the rear of the stage, past the open bar, through the crowd of influences pretending to care about marriage. I slipped into the corner behind the light rig where the AV feed was looped through a single tablet mounted to a pedestal. I reached under my coat, attached a tiny signal booster coated in matte black resin, impossible to see unless you knew it was there. I tapped it twice. It blinked. Online, Casey sent the confirmation visual loop engaged. You're in the blind spot. Venus core now accessible. 4 minutes to breach. I glanced over my shoulder. Ethan was turning toward the AV booth. I smiled, lifted a champagne flute from a nearby tray, and walked right toward him. Claire, he said, masking nothing. Not surprise, not guilt, just calculation. I was beginning to think you'd skip the dancing, he said. I don't dance, I replied and sipped the champagne. Still paranoid, still alive. He chuckled easy, too easy. You know, he said, you always misunderstood what I was building. Still am I, said, letting the silence stretch just long enough to sting. Across the ballroom, the lights flickered. briefly, then stabilized. Casey's voice buzzed in my earpiece. Venus is destabilizing. Nova's got heartbeat lag on the backup servers. Scripture's tunneling in from Sao Paulo node. We're halfway through. Ethan was watching me now. Funny, he said. You disappear and somehow the system still breaks itself. I tilted my head. You think this system broke itself? He smiled again. Systems evolve, Claire. Some of us just learned how to adapt. I took a slow breath. Behind me, the drone swarm dimmed. Their blue scanning lights blinked out one by one like stars winking from the sky. Scripture control towers are blind. Drones falling offline. Repeater nodes unresponsive. 2 minutes. I leaned in closer to Ethan. I used to think you were just reckless, I said. Now I know you're lazy. You're not building anything new. You're just repackaging what we buried years ago and pretending it's a miracle. He didn't respond. His eyes narrowed just slightly. That was enough. Casey Venus breached. Data stream corrupted. Live clone sweep terminated. Storage seed injected with kill commands. It's done. I clinked my glass against his. To the happy couple, I said softly. The lights around us flickered again longer this time. Guests murmured. Someone tapped their phone confused. The memory wall behind the dance floor froze mid-loop, then blinked out completely. The photographer looked around annoyed. And Ethan? He stood still, watching me, because he knew something had just ended. He just didn't know how loud it was going to get. The power didn't cut all at once. It stuttered like breath caught in the throat of the room. First, the light ring above the dance floor blinked twice, then dimmed. The music slowed for a fraction of a beat. People looked up. No one panicked. Not yet. Then the live memory wall snapped to black, and that's when silence fell. There was no announcement, no scream. Just a single screen in the center of the venue previously cycling through pre-shot wedding photos flickering back to life. This time it wasn't champagne toasts and drone footage. It was code, white on black, streaming fast, raw, unfiltered, the kind that doesn't look like anything unless you've seen it before. And then, video, blurry at first. A security cam feed, one of the booths, a guest entering, smiling, a little buzzed. He leans toward the screen, scans his face. Then a second feed pops up beside it. The same guest, only this time it's a deepfake. Flawless mimicry. Repeating voice commands, logging into a bank account, approving a smart home lock override. Facial confirmation accepted. The room shifted. I didn't move. The screen split again. 4 feeds now. 8. 16. Guests smiling, laughing, signing guest books, tapping touch screens, while in parallel their digital ghosts committed crimes they hadn't authorized and never would have imagined. No one had to explain it. The implication was loud enough. They weren't guests. They were inventory. Gasps rose. Someone dropped a glass. I heard the sharp inhale of someone recognizing their own face on the screen. At the center of it all, Ethan stood motionless. He didn't blink, didn't speak. His smile was gone. That was enough. I stepped forward into the open. Casey's voice crackled in my earpiece. Stream is clean. Latency under 2 seconds. Local media node is live. You're on every guest device and half the county's fiber line, meaning we were no longer in just this ballroom. We were everywhere. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. Some of you may not know me, I said, gaze locked on Ethan. My name is Claire Morgan. I used to work in threat intelligence for a federal data unit. Before my file was erased. Before a name like his I flicked my eyes toward him was made too expensive to prosecute. People turned. Phones rose. Ethan still hadn't spoken. I stepped closer. This wedding, I said, is a shell. An operation. Designed to harvest biometric identities through hospitality-grade devices disguised as novelty tech. I nodded at the frozen memory wall. Every selfie, every customized message, every interactive toast, all of it was tagged, scraped, and streamed into an offshore server for replication. A collective inhale. One woman clutched her husband's hand. Another stared at the screen with a hand covering her mouth. Then I delivered the part that would end him. The entire operation was routed through a data aggregator called Venus, a node built from federal source code I wrote and re-engineered illegally by Ethan Cross and his shell company, Cygnus. I turned to the audience now. Each of you was cataloged, and if I hadn't shown up tonight, you'd never know you'd been duplicated, sold, and exploited. And then from the back of the room, a voice. Is this true? It came from a councilman, one of Ethan's public investors. Ethan opened his mouth, closed it. His silence rang louder than any denial. Behind me, the screen changed again. Not surveillance this time. Documents, company filings, paper trails, emails, Claire Morgan buried in blacklists. Ethan Cross, unprosecuted, protected, promoted. Now it wasn't just guests watching. It was reporters, live streams. Because somewhere in that room, Casey had cracked the wedding site's promo hub and hijacked the live stream Our Love link. The whole country was watching. Ethan stepped forward, finally, but he didn't deny it. He just looked at me and said, "You don't understand what's coming." And I said, "You're right. You won't be here to see it." That was when the doors swung open. Not police, feds. 3 agents flanked by 2 local marshals, silent, direct. One of them approached Ethan without ceremony. "Mr. Cross, you'll come with us." He didn't resist, didn't run. He just looked at me as they took his arms, not angry, just empty. They walked him out of the ballroom. No applause, no protest, just an echo in the aftermath of exposure. I stood there for a moment longer, let the silence soak, let them feel it, the sound of a system collapsing in on itself. Then I stepped back 1 pace at a time until I disappeared into the crowd again, not as a guest, not as a ghost, but as the one who held the light up to the lie and didn't flinch. They took him out in cuffs just before the fireworks were scheduled to start. No music, no send-off, just the echo of polished shoes across marble tile and the snap of camera shutters behind pillars and potted palms. One by one, guests realized this wouldn't be the kind of wedding they could post about. By morning, every screen I passed had his face on it. Ethan Cross arrested at private event in Magnolia County. Fraud, unlawful data harvesting, federal security breaches alleged. Claire Morgan, formerly disavowed whistleblower, identified as lead informant. They didn't know the half of it. The press called me brave. The agencies called me vital. Even the mayor's office left a message asking if I'd consider a citation ceremony in recognition of cyber civic service. I didn't respond. I didn't want my name on another podium. I didn't want another folded flag. I'd had enough of being useful when it was convenient and invisible when it wasn't. I went home, the real one. The house I hadn't stepped into since I disappeared. My mother opened the door like she was expecting someone else. My father stood behind her, hands in pockets, eyes low. No one said anything for the first few seconds. Then my mother stepped aside. I walked in. The furniture hadn't changed. The photos hadn't either, except one. On the mantel beside Grace's graduation portrait sat a new frame. Black wood, clean glass. It held a screenshot taken from the stream. My face mid-sentence. Eyes sharp. No smile. Behind me, Venus unraveling on the big screen. I didn't ask who printed it. I didn't need to. After a long silence, my father said, "We watched it." That was all. I nodded. That was all I could give. Later that night, I passed Grace in the driveway. She was sitting in her car engine, off makeup smudged. She didn't look at me, just said I thought he loved me. I didn't answer. Some lies are too clean to touch. The next morning, someone sent me a bouquet of white orchids. No card. Just a ribbon tied in the same pattern the Venus code used for ID sync. Casey. I left the flowers outside, let the wind do whatever it wanted with them. The shop sat at the edge of town. No neon sign, no website. Just an old hand-painted window that said, "Morgan Repairs, no questions, just fixes." Some people thought it was a joke. Most drove past without looking twice. That's the way I liked it. Inside, the lights buzzed soft. The walls were lined with cracked monitors, half-built towers, old hard drives that still whispered secrets. I kept the coffee black and the music low jazz, mostly with enough static to drown out thought. People came in for broken ports and blue screens, but they stayed when I asked. Has it been running hot? Slowing down? Acting like it's listening? They always blinked, then nodded. One Tuesday, a girl walked in. Maybe 13. Baggy hoodie, scuffed sneakers. She didn't say much, just handed over a scratched-up school laptop and pointed at a sticky note taped to the back. It read, "It turns on by itself." I powered it up. Saw the ghost process immediately, a silent listener embedded deep inside the OS. School-issued spyware, geopings, camera bursts. It had been watching her for weeks. She sat quiet, arms crossed, staring at the floor. "Someone told me you don't just fix things," she said. I looked up at her, then smiled just a little. "You're safe now," I said. "I know how to pull it out by the root." She didn't smile back, but she didn't look afraid anymore either. That was enough, because not every fight ends in fireworks. Some just sit quietly in the back of a dusty room, waiting, watching, guarding the gate.